Hello and welcome to Board Game Bonkers. I'm Jay Sears, and today I want to talk about 10 frustrating board game rules. These are frustrating board game rules that the public, the people, have chosen. So I've scoured the internet, I've looked at various different videos. I will put the link in the description down for those videos that I've watched, as well as looking at different forum posts and Discord channels on what people consider are the most frustrating board game rules. So these are the top 10 frustrating board game rules that you, the people, board gamers, perceive as the most frustrating out of all the board game rules. Now, do I agree with this list? I would say yes. I think this 10 are without doubt the most frustrating board game rules. Now, there are a couple on this list that perhaps are not so forefront in today's board gaming market, but a lot of them are still present in today's games. So let's kick off with our number one, and this is in no particular order. So number one is limited dice, resources, and cards. So what I mean is you're playing a game and you need particular resources, perhaps some dice and cards, but you're limited. So perhaps on your turn you have to discard a certain amount, even though you've acquired those and you've worked hard to get those resources, cards and dice, but you have to get rid of them because the rules state that you can only have so many. Now, that's fine if perhaps you're playing an adventure type of game or traveling where you have a backpack and you can only physically carry so much. That makes sense. However, it doesn't make sense where I've got to discard and get rid of resources when I'm not traveling, I'm not carrying them. So why am I getting rid of them? So that can be frustrating and it can really feel downbeat. It can make you feel like you've kind of failed yourself and not being able to work out, well, okay, I wasted some actions getting these resources and I've now lost them. So I haven't optimized my turn. And that can make people extremely annoyed with themselves. And it doesn't make sense that you've worked hard to get these resources, cards or dice, and now I have to get rid of them just because the rules say that. I haven't lost them because I've done something silly where perhaps I have done something in the game that triggers something that then means that I have to lose a resource because of my own particular action, not because the rules state that I've got too many, I have to get rid of them. So that can be extremely annoying and frustrating. So let's now move on to our second one, and that is merging forces. So what do I mean by merging forces? So there are some games where, but particularly in those kind of fantasy or war type games, where you can merge forces and you merge in sides to become even stronger. The problem with that is that you can become overpowered. Therefore, in a free player game or an uneven game, there's going to be one player or faction that is going to be completely outnumbered and outpowered because the merging forces usually will be far more powerful. And then we'll gain that traction to become more powerful and we'll probably end up winning the game. So that can create a very uneven balance in gameplay and make players feel a little bit anxious when that merge happens because they're thinking, oh my goodness, I'm now going to compete against that. And also make them feel a little bit miserable when they start getting the butt and ass kicked because they're frequently getting hammered because of how powerful that other force is. And that can be extremely depressing at times because you feel that you've worked so hard, particularly in a long game, if it's a 2-3 hour game, and all of a sudden there's a merge that then cripples you. That is devastating. So how is that fun as a rule where you introduce merging that completely breaks the game and imbalances the gameplay? It isn't fun. So it's a very frustrating rule that a lot of people do not find fun or exciting. Well, it's great for the people who have merged because they think, well, fantastic, we can just crush that other faction now. It's not great for the other player. It really does spoil the games. There are still some that introduce merging, and if it's not done correctly, it doesn't work at all. So let's now move on to number 3, and that is aggressive rules. So a positive action equals a negative outcome. So you might think, well, hang on a minute, if I do something and I make a mistake, or perhaps it's an action I've carried out and I've fought my turn through, I'm not talking about that. That's different. I'm talking about, and I'll give you an example, Zombicide. So in the original Zombicide, you would shoot the zombies. Now, if you missed, it automatically hit your own team. Why? If they're not there in line in sight, why am I hitting them? Why can't I hit another zombie? It just didn't make any sense. You're being punished for doing something positive. I'm going to try and attack the zombies because I need to get rid of them. Oh, I've missed. So rather than hitting the wall or the window, I've now hit my own player. It doesn't make sense. So obviously they changed that when they brought out the second edition and they fixed that problem. So now you don't automatically hit your own player. So that is an example of a positive action you're taking that has a negative outcome, and that's different for a sign of silliness or stupidity where you take a positive action and that has a consequence because you perhaps didn't do it in the right order, or perhaps you took the wrong action, it was a wrong option, rather than you having a positive action that then automatically results in a negative outcome completely out of your control just because the rules say that is a negative outcome. That's extremely frustrating for a lot of people. And particularly aggressive rules that really put into play where if something negative and bad is to happen, it's so crippling that it does so much damage to you as a player, it makes you feel worthless. It makes you feel so frustrated because you think, well, what's the point of me playing this game? I'm just going to get crushed by this one rule that really destroys me as a player. It's not enjoyable. Now, you could argue that is feed your people an aggressive rule, you don't feed your people, then you're crippled by getting these negative points. Well, you could argue and say, well, hang on a minute, that's the player's fault for not planning. You're right. But is the rule so aggressive that it cripples the player? And that's what we're talking about here. And that frustrates a lot of players. There's got to be a balance between, okay, I haven't fed my people, so I get penalised. That's fine, that's fair. But not, I don't feed my people and I get crippled. That is different. That's what we're talking about here. And it can be harsh. Agricola, I find harsh when it comes to feed your people and that you get penalised. I think it's 6 points minus. That is significant. That happens twice, you more or less may as well sit out because you're not going to win the game. So that to me imbalances it. So let's now move on to number 4. And that is, you can't take the same action as the other player. Now let's use the classic worker placement, okay? I place my worker here, I can take the action, but you can't. Okay, why? Just because the rules tell you. That's classic in a lot of the older worker placement games. In more modern worker placement games, there's normally a rule that will say, well, you can go there, but you may have to place 2 workers instead of 1. That's fine because I've still got the option, or you have to pay them a resource to use that space, or perhaps the choice and option you've got is not as lucrative as the other player because you went second. That's fine. But being completely restricted by I can't take that action can be frustrating, or perhaps it's not worker placement, it's a game where somebody takes an action, they choose one of the available actions. As the next player, you can't choose that action because the other player's already taken that action. That is an extremely frustrating rule. Why? Just because the rules state you can't take that action. Now, if we use worker placement as another example and go back to Laws of Waterdeep, where you're restricted by you can't go there because another player's there, that's okay, that's a little bit frustrating. However, what that kind of fixes is that scales it for different player counts. You have an expansion, gives you more places to go to, and you can build buildings. So as the game progresses, the more buildings that come out, the more spaces you've got to go to. So that frustration reduces, and sometimes that's okay. Now, with modern board games, that problem is fixed. So Viticulture is a big piece where you can go anywhere. So that's a kind of your grandiose piece that can go anywhere and break those rules, and that's fine. So there's different ways in how worker placement is developed and fixed that problem over time. But being restricted by you cannot take the action to what another player's taken is extremely frustrating for a lot of players because it makes it impossible to plan. It can increase the downtime because players are thinking much more on their turn because now they know, okay, now I can't take those actions. I need to rethink what I need to do. And that can be frustrating as well. So adds that frustration onto another type of frustration, that is twiddling your thumbs waiting for the players to take their turns. So let's now move on to our number 5, and that is die rolls equal the number of actions you can take. Now, this is very, less so in today's games, but was prominent in quite a few games going back 10 years plus, where you would roll a die and it would tell you how many actions you can take. So that's completely imbalanced, because one player may roll a 6 and get 6 actions, and someone may roll a 1 and get 1 action. Well, how's that fair? So I've seen this in a game where there was, I think it was a D20, which was absolutely bonkers, where someone would get a plethora of actions and someone would get very few actions. That is broken because it balances the game so much and frustrates people and really angers them if they're consistently rolling low numbers just out of luck, and the other players are getting high numbers. Well, you're never going to win the game if you're getting low numbers all the time. So it just imbalances the game and doesn't make it fun. It's not a rule it really should be in any game, because it completely imbalances unless there's a way to mitigate die rolls. But however, it's just as bad as perhaps your bag building or bag pooling. So you're taking out perhaps some chips out of a bag and it'll tell you how many actions you've got. Well, that can be just as harsh, because you might be lucky and get all the high numbers, somebody might get all the low numbers. Just make it everyone gets the same number of actions, and that makes it fair. Perhaps you can unlock more actions from, perhaps in Scythe, for example, as you start taking those cubes off, because you've worked hard to get those cubes off and use that as part of your strategy and unlock more actions. That is different than be completely functional and the outcome of a die roll. So let's now move on to number 6, and that is the lack of choice. That flows in nicely from number 5. So the lack of choice is, I have 1 or 2 actions and that is it. Now that's different from a small game that's function is just to be played in 10 to 15 minutes. We're talking here about games that are quite big and usually last, anywhere 1 hour plus, and you have only a couple of choices. Or perhaps it's a game, as the last player, you are restricted by 1 or 2 choices. Now there are a few games that do that. And yes, you may argue, well, when it comes back then to the first player, you have more choice. Well, that isn't fun for the player going last, because half the time you've got an action you don't want. Well, what's the point? That's boring. So I've got, 1 or 2 actions? I don't want those actions. What do? Well, I have to take them. I've got no choice, because that's the only actions that are available. That isn't fun. That isn't fun at all. And there's quite a lot of games that do that, especially in worker placement, where you have that restriction that you can't go to another place that another player's at, and you're restricted by, well, there's only 1 or 2 other options. And the other way this is frustrating as well is a game that only gives you 1 or 2 actions when it's actually a bigger game with a lot of depth, but you constantly only have 1 or 2 actions on your turn. That is frustrating. So rules like that, where it completely restricts you and doesn't give you a function to break those rules, to give you some options, can be extremely frustrating. That's different if you've got a couple of worker placement action spots, and perhaps you've got some action cards you can take, and you can get some resources for exchanging cards, resources. That's a little bit different because you have more options. I'm talking here, you're completely restricted by 1 or 2 options on your turn. That's frustrating for a lot of players. And it makes it tough as well to plan ahead. So let's now move on to our number 7, and that is probably the most ridiculous rule I've ever come across, and that is lose a turn. Now, this is prominent in children's games. You won't really find this much in adult games apart from party games. And it's prominent in a lot of party games where you may lose a turn or draw a card and you lose a turn, or you've moved into a space that tells you lose a turn. How is that fun for anyone? How on earth can a designer think that is fun or funny? It is as fun as watching paint dry on a bloody wall. It is ridiculous. A lot of people get so frustrated with losing a turn. How is that fun? I've planned, right, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I've now lost a turn because a card says I've lost a turn. It's it's mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling why anyone would put this in a bloody rule. It's ridiculous, it's stupid. Just don't put it in bloody rules. So if you're a game designer watching this, do not ever put this in the bloody rules. Lose a turn. It is not fun, it's not frustrating, it's negative. People hate it. End of conversation. Let's move on to number 8. And that is uneven turns. Now, this really, really frustrates me. I'm going to use this example. So Dominion and Scythe both do this, okay? So in Dominion, as soon as the deck runs out, So it's either free decks or there's you've got the kind of point cards that you get. I forgot what they're called. Once one of those decks run out, all the game's finished. So you could be the first player that then achieves that, but the second player, who's next, for example, might be, okay, I've got a plan where I could perhaps tip the winnings over to me if I do this, but I can't because the game's ended. And that other player's got more turns than what I have. Scythe does it, so the first player that achieves the objectives that are set out, well, and gets, I think it's 4 or 5, I can't remember, you then end the game. So I've played Scythe where I've had a plan and thought, right, okay, I've got a chance on my next turn, I can do 2 or 3 in one go, achieve 2 or 3 objectives in one go. Great, I'm ready for this. And then the game ends. And I'm thinking, if I just get one more turn, which I should do to make it even, I could potentially win this game, or draw at least. And it's frustrating with his uneven turns. One player gets more turns than the other. How is that fun? How does that make it enjoyable for someone? Now, you could argue and say, well, it's a race game. Whoever gets there first is the winner. But it's not fun for those who perhaps have planned and are long-term planners and are ready for a big epic turn, and perhaps it's their last turn and they've got a chance to win the game, but that's taken away from them because someone else has met that objective before the other player and therefore had more turns than the other player. That doesn't sound fun. Does that sound fun to you? Well, you could argue and say, well, it's a race game. You got there first, then you should be rewarded by being the winner. And that's fine. But I just find it frustrating that there's uneven turns. Easy fixes, just make it even. So everyone in the game gets the same number of turns. They're treated fairly. And they're treated fairly regardless of what the bloody rules say, because it is frustrating when there's uneven turns. You may as well give somebody more actions than the other player, because that's essentially what you've done. It's the same thing. So let's now move on to our number 9, and that is first player advantage. Now, it's fine where games give some advantage to the first player, and that's fine if it evens out for the other players. And what I'm talking about here is the first player advantage. So first player gets all the choices, particularly as worker placement or option to get cards. So they're first player and the turn order doesn't change. That is so frustrating. Now, some games might fixes begin right at the start of the game, the fourth player gets additional resources, third player gets some resources, etc. But if the turn order doesn't change over a prolonged period of time, that value of those resources is worth nothing, because the first player always has the best choices and options on their turn. Now, if turn order changes, that's fine, because turn order changes, and as long as there's even turns, then that's okay. Or there's an option to change the order based on your strategy that you're using, perhaps as a way to get the first player token or marker, but that can be flawed as well, because sometimes if it's too easy or too lucrative to be the first player, that can uneven things out as well. So it can be frustrating when the first player has such a significant advantage over all the other players. So it's important to try and even that out and how games are designed. But of course, that's down to the game designer to try and balance that out. But it can feel overpowering when the first player has a significant advantage over all the other players. That's not fun for the other players. Now let's move on to our final one, number 10. And that is probably one of the most stupidest rules, although there's a caveat to this, is a cooperative game that prevents sharing. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not talking about cooperative where perhaps we're in different rooms on a board, so therefore we can't share because I don't know what you've got as a player. That's different, because that makes thematic sense. I'm talking about a rule that I'll use Pandemic as an example. So I can tell you what cards I've got, but I can't show you. Like, what? It doesn't make any sense. I can tell you, so I'm going to ask you 20 times what your card is, what cards you've got in your hand, but you can't show me. It's just the most stupidest rule ever. Or if I'm in the same rule, I can't share with you or show you what I've got. Why? I'm in the same bloody room as you. What, is there a screen there stopping me from sharing and seeing what you've got? It just doesn't make any sense. So why would you have a rule that prevents you from sharing when you're in the same room? That's different if you're in a different room, or perhaps you're on a map and you're somewhere else. That's fine. Perhaps you haven't got any way of communicating. Now, in a modern world, usually we've got mobile phones or walkie-talkies or something to communicate, so there might be a sense to communicate some way. So it's got to make thematic sense, and it has to be done within some sense of commonality or common sense where you can communicate at certain points that make sense, not put a stupid rule in that you can't communicate, or I can only half communicate something but not give you all the information just because the rules state that, not because we're in the same room. It's just mind-boggling why people put rules in like that. And cooperative games where you're supposed to cooperatively work together, but you can't because rules say you can't talk. Why? Because the rules say that. You can't look at each other. You can't see what information you've got. No, it's not a bloody cooperative game then, is it? Frustrating. Okay, so that brings us to the end. Now, I will put the links in the description down below for the other videos where you can check those out on frustrating rules. And these are what the public, the people have chosen as the most frustrating top 10 board gaming rules. And you can see why. I get frustrated with a lot of them. They don't make sense. They don't make sense thematically, and they don't make sense practically for an enjoyable experience. And they can spoil someone's gaming session, or perhaps they're new into gaming and their first taste of a gaming experience is frustration. Well, that doesn't bode too well for the future of gaming then if we have all these frustrating rules in. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and it's a little bit different, a little bit of a rant, and a little bit of seeing what the public feel is frustrating in board gaming. Now, if you haven't done so, please do consider subscribing to the channel and comment down below. What are your frustrating rules? Do you agree with these rules? Do you find that some of them are okay? Well, let us know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you. And that brings us to the end. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, take care.